Thank you, Carl, for inviting me back. I'm really exceptionally delighted to be here and very, very impressed with all that's happened at UT since I've been here, since I left, I guess. The buildings are beautiful, the technology center is spectacular, and I'm very pleased to be the first speaker here. My talk today will consist of 3 parts. As Carl mentioned, I have several research areas. I will not attempt to discuss all of the different ways that computers and other forms of technology can be used in either applied linguistics research or in the teaching and learning of second languages. But in fact, research in computer-assisted language learning, or CALL, has been conducted in many of the same areas being studied today in applied linguistics. Today, I will focus on 3 main areas of my own research, from phonology to intercultural communication. First, I will discuss technology for describing and teaching prosody. That's number 1. Then I will share the results of almost 14 years of work on using multimedia aids for improving L2 reading comprehension and vocabulary acquisition. That's number 2 on this list. And finally, number 3, I will discuss intercultural learning using computer-mediated electronic networks. What ties all 3 areas together is an increasing focus on discourse-level aspects of SLA. And I know that discourse, of course, is a big topic here at UT. But you might have noticed there's a little asterisk after the word communicative competence, intercultural communicative competence. Some of you might agree that intercultural communication can involve different generations of the same family. As the parent of 2 generation Mers, where M can stand for millennia, millennial, multimedia, or multitasking, I get through life with the help of the Zits comic strip. Zits captures having teenagers so well, it's unbelievable. All right, but to the real part of the talk, to the real talk, the first part on speech technologies. Well, my relationship with technology as an applied linguist began many, many years ago when I was a graduate student working on my dissertation. Although I had been studying historical Germanic linguistics, I took the only 2 courses on applied linguistics that were available at UC Berkeley at the time. And I decided that I wanted to write a dissertation about tone and intonation in the 3 languages I knew, English, German, and Chinese. So I set out to investigate whether, if and how L2 learners transferred the intonational patterns of their L1 into an L2. At the time, and obviously it was many, many, many years ago, the only realistic and affordable technology was what is considered ultra low-tech today, and it's almost extinct, namely the analog version of the tape recorder. But I can't tell you how many hours I spent playing and replaying sentences, play, rewind, play, pause, whatever, drawing my own pitch curves, erasing them, and drawing them again. But if we fast forward many years to today, it is now easy and affordable to record digitally speech, whether in any language, obviously, and to use excellent freeware and software to perform acoustic analyses. You can have pitch curves drawn. You can see what the rhythm of the language looks like acoustically. You can record a learner and transpose that or put that above a native speaker's pitch curves, and all that can be done almost instantaneously. So I would like to briefly tell you about some of the technology that is available today for researching and teaching prosody and helping L2 learners with their, not just with segmentals, vowels, and consonants, but with their suprasegmentals or prosody as well. I recently had an article, a chapter published in a book edited by Martha Pennington, and I review all of the technological advances that have been made for L2 research in phonology as well as for teaching. And so these are the 4 areas that I'm going to touch on today. First of all, speech synthesis, then speech recognition, third, the visualization of prosody, and fourth, using computers to provide audio and video feedback to learners. Okay, the first one of the 4, speech synthesis. Today, as I mentioned, there is readily available hardware and software for processing spoken data. And these are pretty standard on PCs. You know, at least if you get a Mac, you have the text-to-speech algorithm that allows you to type in text and have it speak the text for you. It's also, and I'm sure that PCs have them as well, and there's lots of freeware out there on the internet as well. What I can tell you, and you probably know this, is that speech synthesis is far more advanced than speech recognition. And I want to play you 3 examples, and I want to make sure that we are plugged in. This is done by a speech synthesizer. So text was typed in. They have programmed it so that you type in text and you get back speech.
Our voice offers the highest quality in speech synthesis in a range of voices.
Right?
You can choose male or female voices, younger or more mature, with different regional accents.
So that was synthesized.
As you can hear in these samples, our voices cover a wide range of accents and speaking styles.
So you male, female, different regional accents, but then the third one is my favorite one.
Each time I hear one of these voices, I think, oh my God, this technology is so totally out of this world. I have never heard anything like it before.
Valley Girl speech from California. You sort of have to have grown up, you know, in the West to know what this is all about. But the point is, it was synthesized. They figured out how to do the algorithms to have text come out spoken that way. So I think that we would agree that speech synthesis is actually pretty far along. Not so with speech recognition, although a lot of people have been working on ASR, which stands for Automatic Speech Recognition, to evaluate L2 speech. There is actually a very successful business in California called the PhonePass system, and they have English speakers, well, let's see, L2 English speakers calling in and being evaluated just on the basis of a phone call. So they have a phone call, they answer questions or speak in paragraphs or something, and they get a rating, and then this rating is sent out to companies, and companies can decide, yes, I think I want to hire this person, his or her English is good enough. So work is definitely being done in automatic speech recognition. Calico had a special issue on speech recognition for language learning. Now it's been 8 years. People like Maxine Eskenazi have been working on speech recognition. She's at Carnegie Mellon. And research is also being done in this area. So Derwing et al. And Neri have been doing actual studies. And lo and behold, the pedagogical software is not as good as human listeners. Well, you know, I think we could all have come to that conclusion. There is a program available right now. How many of you are familiar with the Tell Me More software? Okay, a few of you. It's actually one of the best computer programs that I have seen for doing automatic speech recognition and providing some measure of feedback to the learner. So what you can see in this example is you can see what the native speaker has said. I can't run it. I can't run the program for you because it's a PC, a Windows-only program, and I am generally a Mac user. But the native speaker will say something, in this case, gracias, and the student will say it, and you will see the student's rendition right above the native speakers. The program then will give you feedback in terms of how good it thinks your pronunciation is. So trial number 3 only got 6 out of 7 bars, but trial number 4 got the 7 bars, and so you get some indication of how close you were to the native speaker. I have to say that that's, of course, not the final word, because when you really think about it, it is still listen and repeat. Listen and try and imitate the native speaker as well as you can. You are judged by the number of bars you get, you are judged by your pitch curve, but is that enough feedback to give to a learner? That is, of course, is the main question. And my answer right now is simply no, it's not enough. We as language teachers need to be able to describe what is going on that left part and give better feedback to learners. The program as it stands will show you the pitch curve and show you the bars, but otherwise you can break it down and it can tell you, okay, this sound was not right, but it doesn't, I don't think, help the learner enough. So there's still a lot of work for us. We're not out of a job yet. That's the good news. Okay. One of the things that I've thought about for many, many years since my dissertation is that perhaps, the idea of being able to visualize an intonation curve might help with improving pronunciation.
Marie drank tea.
Marie trank Tee.
Bebió.
So here I just happen to have 3 different languages, with the same sentence, and research has been, I have not yet myself been able to conduct the kind of research that I wanted to conduct. The first step, of course, was describing what discourse intonation is all about, how we might be able to teach it, and then developing programs to actually teach it, and then doing research to actually test to see how these, how effective these programs are something that is in my future, I hope. But other colleagues, and I'm not the first one to suggest this. The research actually on using audio and visual feedback for teaching pronunciation, teaching intonation, goes back actually as many as 30 years. So it's not new. The good thing is now it is easier to do. We have the technology. It's affordable. It has not always been the case. But there are people who have actually done studies, and if any of you is interested in looking at actual research studies, Deborah Hardison, who is at Michigan State, has published several articles now. There is one in Language Learning and Technology from 2004, where she looked at providing feedback on French prosody, and she also has a 2005 Calico article in which she discusses results of her studies. She also is looking at discourse-level prosody. So we're talking about above and beyond, certainly above and beyond sounds, but above and beyond simple sentences. She, in the 2005 article, had found that international grad students were having difficulties with discourse functions in English prosody. And I don't know if that's the case here at Texas, but in California it's the case where we have lots of international TAs who are trying to teach math, physics, whatever, in English, and English is not their native language. And so Deborah, among others, I think Lucy Pickering has also worked with international TAs trying to teach in English, looking at prosodic aspects of their speech that make it doubly difficult for students to understand them. So again, it's not just the individual sounds, but it's the chunking, it's the rhythm, and the melody of speech. So she, in her study, found that those graduate students who received discourse level input, and she provided them with video to show video tape recordings of these TAs or of speech. When they had the visual context, they were better able to transfer comprehensible intonation to novel discourse. And she concluded that when you provide discourse level feedback, that is superior to providing simply sentence level kinds of intonation patterns. She used 2 freeware programs. If any of you is interested in doing acoustic analyses or acoustic research, Prot is a really excellent freeware program developed in the Netherlands for doing acoustic analysis, for doing pitch curves, pitch tracking. Anvil is what you see on the screen. You can embed a video into this screen. You can have then the transcript of what the person is saying. You can have the acoustic information at the bottom, the intonation patterns. You can track the gestures, which is what is on the right side. And it is also a freeware tool. It's actually quite amazing. But this is to give you some ideas of what is being done. I've been working with Martha Pennington and Deborah Hardison on looking also at the larger context of speech. So we're going beyond even prosody. And I won't talk about that because I don't have time. But you notice that the hand is really foregrounded and the rest of it is in the background. And the point is, you know, when you're talking, it would be nice, of course, to be able to listen to it, to see the pitch curves, but then there are also these gestures. There's also eyebrow movement, head movement, hand movement, and these are all part and parcel of speech. So again, at the discourse level, these are the kinds of things that I think linguists and applied linguists should be looking at in order to describe what happens in real speech and then also to teach some of these things to our learners. There are a few other things I could tell you about streaming speech, and if anyone is interested, it's also a really excellent program for advanced learners of English, but I don't have time to do that. So I will just sum up the importance of prosody with another Zitz cartoon. So again, of course, you know, in text you can't have sound or gestures or anything, and so you have to use diacritics. All right, so that was, you know, my first area of research. My second area of research has to do with call and L2 reading. And in 2001, at the AAAL meeting in St. Louis, where Dale was, and Dale and I went to the to the Arch. I won't forget that. I also, at that same meeting, attended an excellent colloquium titled Second Language Reading Research in the 21st Century. So this was 2001, just as the 21st century was beginning. And it was called What's New and What's Next? The organizer of the colloquium, Pat Carroll, whom I think a lot of you might know, had put together a list of different areas of L2 reading research and had surveyed her fellow panelists, all eminent scholars in reading research, names you may recognize: Elizabeth Bernhardt, Nick Ellis, Jan Holstein, Michael Kamel, and Batya Laufer. The panelists were asked to place each topic in one of the following categories: what's hot, what's not hot, what should be hot, what should not be hot. The topic that received the most votes as one that should be hot was computer-assisted technology, and that one received a vote from all of the panelists. So, sorry, I guess I should have been showing this. So just last year, I finished an article for the Calico volume, and I summarized the last 10 years of research in reading, in L2 reading using technology, that were based on Grabe's 10 implications for instruction from research. Grabe's second instructional implication was to emphasize the learning of vocabulary. To this end, research has been conducted on electronic dictionaries by the names you see on the slide, to name but a few. I also heard a really excellent presentation by Batya Laufer just, oh my gosh, was it just 4 days ago? She came to UCSB and gave a talk, and she had lots of interesting statistics, one of which was, what percentage of the words of a text does a native speaker have to know in order to read fluently and well in the native language? Any guesses? It's incredibly high. It's incredibly high. She said 95. Now, it kind of depends on what level of comprehension you're talking about. It is incredibly high, which means that for L2 learners and readers, we really need to be focusing on vocabulary as well. So that was one of my reasons for starting to develop materials for reading, as well as for trying to help L2 learners learn vocabulary. So what I can tell you very briefly in a nutshell, in this summary I did of the last 10 years of research, is that there have been varying results of using technology, specifically things like electronic dictionaries. There have been varying results, and it often very heavily depends on the level of the learners, the ability level of the learners, and it cannot be generalizable to all L2 learners. So the upshot is we cannot say categorically, oh yes, using technology, using electronic dictionaries definitely helps vocabulary learning. The jury is still out on that. Even though research has flourished, we just don't have the decisive conclusions that we wish we did about which types of annotations are best for L2 vocabulary acquisition. Most studies do suggest that L2 vocabulary is learned better when both a graphic, a visual kind of gloss is looked up in addition to a translation. And a number of studies have shown this. Some of them are on the back of your handout. I wasn't able to fit all of the studies, but I believe this presentation is going to be put up on the web. So you can come back and look for all of these other references that I've listed here. For the past 14 years, I have been studying the effects of a multimedia program for L2 vocabulary acquisition and reading comprehension that we developed at UCSB in 1993. I'm going to briefly show you how the program works and then briefly again present the results of our last 14 years of research. So we have short stories, and at the beginning of each short story we have a video preview, I guess you would call it, to give the readers a sense of what the story is going to be about. So I'm playing just the beginning of one of them.
Wenn die Haifische Menschen wären, würden sie für die kleineren Fische sorgen. Sie würden zum Beispiel manchmal für die kleinen Fische Wasserfeste geben.
Any German speakers in here? No, okay, not a one. The name of this, it's a story by Brecht, Bertolt Brecht, and it's called If Sharks Were People or Were Men. And so the sentence that was just that you just heard is actually a sentence from the story. If sharks were people, they would take care of the little fish. So it's an allegory, as you might expect from Brecht. But students first get that, and they would give water parties. That's why you saw the little water party there. They would take care of the little fish, and they would give water parties for the little fish. So the students first see a preview, and then they get to the text. And then they are able to look up words that have been glossed in the text. So they get a word and they drag it and they can see a picture annotation.
Die Haifische.
They also hear the word spoken, singular and plural forms. They can sometimes, for certain words, see a little video clip that's supposed to explain the word. Or, of course, they can get the English translation.
Die Haifische.
Oh, no, sorry, that's the German definition. Or they can get an English translation. So they have 4 different possibilities for glosses.
Die Wirtinnen.
I can tell you that it's becoming increasingly clear that, in general, individual differences play an important role in the effectiveness of multimedia software. So we talk about differences in learning styles, namely visual learners versus more text-oriented or verbal learners. We've been looking at working memory capacity, which is another sort of psychological measurement that one could obtain and try to understand how learners are learning. And again, I'll show you some of the key results of our studies, some of which are fairly conclusive and others of which are not as conclusive as we would have liked them to be. So in one of the early studies published in the Modern Language Journal, we had 103 subjects, or participants, sorry, from Santa Barbara, Stanford, and UCLA. And what we found was that If they looked at both a picture and a text annotation, both of them, they did better on vocabulary tests. If they looked up text only, the vocabulary results weren't as good. If they looked up video and text, they weren't as good. Other studies, there's a study by Al-Seghire in LLT. He sort of found the opposite, where the video and text lookup was better than the still graphic and text. We did a different kind of calculation using these same 103 participants, and that was published in the Journal of Educational Psychology, where same idea. If you get no annotations, your vocabulary learning is lowest. If you get visual only, it's a little bit better. If you get verbal only, it's a little better. But if you look up both, then it's the best. So the idea is it's not one or the other, but it's some kind of combination that reinforces the learning. Visual plus verbal, that is the text annotation. Plus, I think hearing it must also have helped to some degree. We then tried to tease out, if you think about learning styles and visualizers and verbalizers, can we find a difference in how visualizers use multimedia annotations versus verbalizers? And although I'm not going to go into the details of the study, but you can see that what happens is visualizers are helped when they get visual annotations. So the little circles are the visualizations. When visualizers get verbal annotations, they don't do very well. When verbalizers get verbal annotations, they do very well. When visualizers get visual annotations, they do well. When they get verbal annotations, they don't do well. So that was kind of an interesting result. Even though the concept, and I know the concept of learning styles is very, very questionable, but we based it in part on their lookup behavior. In other words, if they tended to look up visuals, did they also learn from them, versus if they tended to look up verbal annotations, did they tend to learn from them? And that was a nice result to find that, yes, that was the case. But we have now conflicting data in a later study with 152 participants when we forced them to look up either verbal only or visual only or both. And we would like to believe that if we force them to look up both, then they will do very well. What this graph shows you is that if you are of the students with higher verbal ability did in fact do very well when they were given both. They also did well when they were given only visual, not so well when they were given only verbal, and no one did well when they were given both. But the low verbal ability learners, these little chartreuse bars, did not, they experienced some sort of cognitive load when they were forced to look up both. So there's really always a trade-off. You know, on the one hand, yes, the multimedia seems to reinforce learning, but on the other hand, if it causes cognitive load for a learner who is not going to benefit from a particular kind of annotation, then it backfires on you. And all I'm saying is multimedia is not the final answer. We have to look further. We have to look, for example, at individual differences, and that's something that I've been doing with Scott Payne, where we've been looking at phonological working memory capacity and how that is or is not correlated to use of multimedia. And one thing we did find was that the low span individuals looked up significantly more words than the high span. So they needed that extra kind of crutch, and they were able to fulfill that need to some degree by looking up multimedia words, multimedia glosses. This is sort of typical of what you find in research on multimedia in general, that lower ability learners can benefit from good, innovative technological software, but it's not something that we've found, you know, in every study we did. We just did another one recently, and we didn't find that same result. So that was a little bit discouraging. But I need to move on because I know that time is running out. Very, very quickly, over 14 years, we've looked at the lookup behavior of users. Hence the title of my talk, What Makes Students Click? What do students click on? What do they look up? And we are finding that, except for this sort of anomalous 2002 study, students are just looking up. They're not looking up the visuals. That's a graph of how many of the visual annotations they look up. Multimedia is old hat by now, and they're just going straight for the translation. Just give me the translation. I don't want to see video clips. I don't want to look at graphics. So to quickly summarize what we found in the last 14 years of studies of multimedia glosses, only one of them has shown that reading comprehension is improved by multimedia. And that was actually a study of the video preview. Some had the video preview, others did not. The glossing doesn't, the lookup behavior with glossing doesn't seem to affect reading comprehension at all. A little bit discouraging. So that is why we need to look toward the future. And in a 2003 article, Bernhardt suggested that for L2 reading ability, when you're reading in a second language, she was trying to figure out what percent of your ability to read is due to L1 literacy, and she determined that it was about 20%. What percent is due to L2 vocabulary knowledge, and she determined that was about 30%. So that leaves 50% unaccounted for, right? And this is, I think, an area, and I know that she's working on it, as are other people here. You know, we have to figure out what the remaining 50% is all about. Is it motivation? Is it prior knowledge? Is it purpose of reading? Is it the goal of reading? And all of these related, some of them affective, more affective factors. I think that we also need to focus more on top-down comprehension. So although Cyberbuch and Cyberteca tended to be more bottom-up in terms of the individual glossing of words, I think that one of the things I want to look into in the future is more top-down kinds of issues that deal with prior knowledge and that deal with comprehension. All right, I have 10 more minutes maybe? Okay. So I will then tell you about my third area of research. And I have a few more acronyms to decipher, although many of you are probably familiar already with CMC, which stands for Computer-Mediated Communication. ICC stands for Intercultural Communicative Competence, a la Michael Byram, 1997. And so when we think about using CMC for developing intercultural communicative competence, we want to start first with principles of SLA, first and foremost, before we start thinking about ways to use CMC to further these goals. And so I'm sorry, but I need to move quickly, so I'm not going to read everything on the slide. What I do want to tell you is that, you know, language learning and technology is now in its 10th year of publication. And in the last 5 years, these are the topics that have been the most popular ones in terms of number of articles that are submitted as well as those that end up actually being published. So CMC is by far at the top of the list. Culture is a distant second, but yet it's the second most popular topic. So I think that someone was asking me earlier today, you know, what is the future of, you know, technology for language learning? And I would have to say that using computers to mediate communication obviously is one of the hot issues, and then the teaching and learning of culture and intercultural competence would be another one. Really briefly, I want to show you what we have done using CMC for developing intercultural competence with our learners. And so I want to show you very briefly a project that we did. We had second-year German classes at UCSB, and we had partner classes at the University of Kassel in Germany. And we did it online, so it's actually the lowest tech of anything that I've done, if you consider email and forums as low tech. We didn't do video conferencing, even though we thought about that, but that might, be higher tech. And so we had them fill out, first I did pre-questionnaires, and we asked them questions like, what does the word or concept culture mean to you? What do you think people need to know in order to belong to a particular culture? Which cultures do you belong to, and how do you know that you belong to them? Anyway, so a pre-questionnaire just getting at what their concepts of culture were. And then we had, based on the students' input, we had a couple of different, two main topics for this one particular quarter. We did college life and Americans and Germans. And so what happens is students first fill out questionnaires in their L1, in their native language. So the American students did that. The German students had translated questions, and they filled out the questionnaires in German. And the reason for this is that we are getting authentic input by L1 speakers to provide us with the stuff, with the actual materials that we're going to use in class. The discussions afterwards then, half were in English, half were in German, so that both groups benefited from the exchange. In other words, the German students at first complained, well, why are we writing in English? We're here to learn German. But the point was to form the content base. We wanted people writing in their native language. The discussions then were in L2, and certainly in the classroom they were all done in L2. So we asked them questions about university. Do you still live at home? One of the interesting things was that a lot of the German students still lived at home. And for an American student, that's pretty unusual. At least, if you're at a community college, maybe it's not so unusual to live at home. But if you're at UT or UCSB, chances are you don't live at home anymore. So there were questions about that. We also had questions about manners and social norms in the U.S., what you would say if someone expresses an opinion that you don't agree with at all. We had a whole battery of different kinds of questions. And so they responded, and then what you see in the results are both groups' answers. And I don't know how well you can see that, but students then were able to view what each side had said. So the Germans answered the question, and the Americans answered the question, and then the follow-up, of course, was discussing similarities and differences. And what we found was that when the differences were really great, so one of the questions was, what would you do if you saw another student cheating on an exam? And the American students said, oh, well, we would be terribly upset. We would go and report it to the teacher, and we'd be very angry. And the German students said, we wouldn't do anything. So there was a case where, because of the big differences, a lot of discussion ensued, and students really wanted to find out, well, why is that? And they came up with all kinds of hypotheses about why it was the case in one culture and not the other. The discussion seemed lively, and they seemed to be content-rich. When the answers were too similar, students didn't, they just said, oh, they think the same way we do. It was just old hat. But if you looked more closely at the results, you would see that, well, there were differences, but they were more subtle. And so the point that I want to make here is that it isn't enough just to have an exchange where people talk to each other or have online comparisons or have discussions in forums or email exchanges with partners. We must follow up in the classroom. We must, as teachers, read what the students are writing, and if they miss subtle points, we must bring it back into the classroom. Let me go back to the So we did find that because students themselves were creating authentic language, that did seem to help a little bit in helping them to acquire intercultural communicative competence. And we are looking at both what is said as well as the pragmatics involved to try and help our learners make sense of what they're reading and discussing with their peers abroad. So to some extent, yes, they co-constructed new knowledge, they negotiated meaning, they asked questions, they asked for clarification, they made hypotheses, especially when the differences were great. But, and so they did develop some of the components of Byram's and Gramsci's model of intercultural communicative competence, where culture is viewed as a dynamic system and not just a set of facts or artifacts. We did find, though, that they made a lot of generalizations. And they made a lot of statements that really were not substantiated by the data. So here you have a case of seeing or hearing only what you want to see or hear. And even though it's there, even though you have this marvelous exchange, they've still got blinders on to some extent. So this is not where we stop, right? We must follow up in the classroom. And a doctoral student who just finished her PhD in 2005 did just that. She was one of the instructors of the course. So she had her students giving oral presentations about their little forum discussions. And this was of course, done in L2 in German. And she tape recorded all of these classroom discussions about the online exchange. And she had 11 forum group discussions and quite a substantial amount of data for each of these discussion groups. And what she found was, this is Evelyn Wade in 2005, she found that they were starting to exhibit some of Byram's and Gramsci's components. They did display some attitudes of curiosity and interest, but they did not display as much openness and critical reflection as we would have liked. So there's lots of room for improvement. There's lots of room for additional work. We must follow up. In some of these classroom discussions, here's an example. The American students complained that the German students didn't seem interested in what they were saying. So this isn't an online discussion, right? How do you arrive at this notion? We're trying to tease out what it is about what the Germans are saying and how they're saying it to make the Americans feel this way. You probably know about cross-cultural pragmatics, so I'm just gonna skip over because I want to talk about what we're looking at some of these forum discussions. So this is the reaction of our students, and we're looking back into the data to figure out why they reacted that way. And preliminary analyses show that the two groups express interest in different ways. We had both controversial and non-controversial topics. And some of the differences are, for example, here. UCSB students tended, as a group, to be a little more indirect, to say, well, I'm not exactly sure why, or possibly one answer might be. Whereas some of the German students were very clear as to, for me, it was clear that this is in no way expressed in the American. So, this sort of way of expressing oneself is a manifestation of pragmatic competence or lack thereof. And these are the things that are picked up by interlocutors. The American students said, oh, the Germans never ask questions. We're always saying, well, what do you think? And, what do you do in Germany? And the German students didn't ask questions. We went back into the data and found that, well, it wasn't really true. So it's interesting how these perceptions are maintained even when the data don't show it. And so that is definitely an area for future research. A number of people, including Juji Abrams here and Julie Belts, have been finding that, goodness, we think this is a great technology and a great way to help learners learn both language and culture, but there are lots of problems. Some of them are institutional problems, even problems of time differences, but there are also much more serious issues that involve how people communicate, how people think about culture, reflect on their own culture or not, and these are issues that we definitely need to keep on researching. Kern et al. In 2004, said that there are some areas, key areas to continue to study include, first, the fact that connectivity does not necessarily translate into successful intercultural learning or understanding. Two, the issue that learners can try to retain their natural discourse styles. In other words, they can try to continue to communicate the way they always do, but they have to become aware of the way the other people are doing it and not take offense at it and not say, oh, well, they're not interested, and not feel that, their partners are not willing to say what they, to say how they feel. The American students also said, I don't think the Germans are being honest with us. And it's interesting. I mean, why, you know, where do they get that? Where do they arrive at that conclusion? So these are sort of anecdotal parts of the project, yet they really tell us what we still need to do in such an exchange. So it's not so much just setting up this kind of communication. It's not necessarily just linguistic misunderstandings, but it's actually sometimes a clash in cultural frames and discourse systems that we as linguists, as applied linguists, as teachers need to be aware of to help our students. So, you know, what Kern et al. Said was that there is no single effect of using online communication, but rather processes and results will vary widely depending on the range of logistical, pedagogical, and social factors. So, 2 more slides. Summary for all 3 areas. For the first area, we have found that visualizations of intonation curves and discourse level context appear to be helpful for learning L2 prosody. There's much more work to be done. Secondly, multimedia glosses seem to be effective for vocabulary learning, but they have not conclusively been shown to aid L2 reading comprehension. Again, lots of work to be done. And thirdly, online intercultural exchanges require extensive follow-up, for example, in the classroom or perhaps, you know, in further online communication. So, to conclude, technology can indeed be a useful tool for specific purposes of L2 and C2 culture learning and teaching, but technology per se has not been effective for all aspects of language and culture learning. Judicious use of technology in support of the principles of SLA, cognitive processing, and cross-cultural interaction is recommended. Technology should not be used simply because it's here, as the final Zit cartoon illustrates. Thank you very much. Yes.
So I really like your research, of course, on CFC because I'm always interested in communicating in that mode. And one of the things that you are implying there is that possibly it's almost as if the students are learning too much about the other culture through the communication medium. I mean, as researchers, it's very interesting to notice where the misunderstandings occur, but it could almost lead for example, the American students learning German to form negative views of the target group, right? I mean, is that partly what you're alluding to, or?
Yes, it is, but I also want to follow up with that and say that when students go abroad, they come back with stronger stereotypes, but also with stronger affinity and positive. So I think that you're going to always get both, and
So it's not any different
So it's not any different, exactly, exactly. But it isn't, of course, the wonderful thing that we thought it might be in the beginning. Exactly, exactly. So, you know, obviously students who go abroad come back totally enriched. They say it's a life-changing experience, but they also say, well, you know, some of those stereotypes about the Germans were really true. So, you know, it's a reinforcement of some of the negative, but then usually the positive outweigh the negative. And here in this case, there is not enough positive, I think, to outweigh some of the negative that they're getting.
What you're saying is that in the classroom, what you can do as a teacher
Yes.
is because it's written
Yes.
and is therefore available for reflection after the fact, you can actually point out, okay, this is not that the person is being arrogant
Yes.
or pushy. This
Exactly.
is a style of talking
Exactly.
that you find in German academics or
Right.
students.
Right. So we have to become instructors of pragmatics as well, and not just of language. So that is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, yeah. Oh, was there one here?
I was just wondering, did you have any trouble there with that form running into problems of formality level of speech? I mean, a lot of people in my generation are used to much lower levels of formality on online forums.
Yeah. Well, you know, for example, in German, it was all in the informal, so it was all the du. There wasn't that kind of problem. We actually, again, sort of anecdotally, when our students said, oh, we don't think the Germans are being honest, we said, well, why? And they said, well, come on, they must drink as much as we do, but yet they don't talk about it, about partying and all of these kinds of things. And then we did find out somehow also anecdotally that some of the Germans were concerned about having their postings online for the world to see. Now, it was password protected, but they were still concerned about who might get a hold of this or who might read it. So these are the kinds of problems that you don't anticipate at all, that could affect very much how people, what they would write or say. And so that is another issue that I think we need to get to, so that we can say, well, yeah, well, maybe they were being a little more reserved for whatever reason, but we don't even know what all the reasons might be. So some of the anecdotal evidence or information is actually quite fascinating. And isn't it a little weird to be corresponding with someone who you've never met? I mean, you know, this happens in academia all the time. You know, I will write. We have come to see that as not weird, but in fact it is kind of strange if you think about it, right? So there'll be people who I have emailed with for years, and then I finally actually meet them face to face, and it's often a surprise as to what they look like and how they are in person, right? So there are many things that are missing from an online communication, not least, you know, gestures, intonation, all of that.
Just as an additional thought about how to have it that the students might communicate in ways that would show cultural differences, but that might allow them to feel a shared sense of connection. The only time I did something similar, I had students here in the U.S. read an article, and then a friend of mine had her students in Korea had read the same article,
Yes.
and they were discussing it with each other.
Yes.
So they had a shared common thing that they were talking about.
Mm-hmm,
You
mm-hmm.
can certainly do that with a movie.
Exactly, yes, yes, that,
Something
yeah.
They had a shared experience.
Exactly. Gilbert Fürstenberg at MIT has this program called Cultura. I don't know if any of you know it. And that is something that she's done. Her students on both sides have viewed the same movie, and then they've talked about it. So that's a great idea. Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of interesting cultural things would come out there.
This is kind of a minor point, but I find myself fixated on it. The Bernhardt equation.
Yes,
for,
yes.
For reading.
Yeah.
20% L1 literacy and 30% L2 vocabulary. There's no X% for internalized L2 fluency. But I see vocabulary
Yeah.
is separate from
Right,
overall language ability.
right, right.
That surely takes up a fair amount of that 50% if any of Pat Carroll's work is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's something I want to look into,
Yeah.
because to me I'm not convinced by these numbers either. I'm just, I think she'd actually, I believe so. I believe so.
I was going to say, part of it bothers me because I've been reading a bit on the vocabulary and the fact that so much of our vocabulary recognition comes from our expectation of what's going to follow.
Yes,
and
yes.
So that we recognize words in the chunk.
Right, right.
Before we even see
Right.
the rest of it. And so if we recognize one word and then the next one comes up, we've already got it, especially in our native language.
Exactly,
And I'm
right.
doing that in Russian and it just loses me.
Oh, that's great. Yes, yes, yes.
I find a word that I was expecting.
Right, right, right.
Okay, so
Yes.
I'm thinking maybe part of that 50 is coming out of that chunk.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so-
Yeah, there are a couple of articles of hers, the 2003, which may or may not be on the handout. I think it is. Is it there? There's something from her, isn't there? Yeah, okay. I think that's the one that has this equation. So I don't remember all the details, but I was sort of struck by these numbers, and that's why I think it's an area for future research, for sure. Oh, thank you.